Operation Veritable by Victory Point Games. This is a game that covers an action that took place on the Western Front of World War II and late in World War II, when the result of the war seemed pretty much clear to everybody. It seemed unavoidable. And this had an important effect on the way in which the troops decided to fight or not to fight. At that point, the Germans saw, again, defeat as unavoidable, so they were pretty much ready to surrender, and the Allies at the same time did not really feel like taking many casualties. One thing is, of course, to die, say, storming the beaches of Normandy, when the fate of the world really hangs in the balance. It depends on the success of your action. That is something that many brave soldiers will find worth dying for. On the other hand, to die, to rush the end of a war when you know that the war is going to end in a victory anyways, just to make that victory happen a little earlier rather than a little later, that is something that, of course, even brave soldiers may think twice about, may find not that appealing. And the game really does a good job to capture this, to adjust the mechanics of the game to the psychological effects, to the psychological factors behind the simply material aspects of the action. This is a small game, it plays in an hour or less, it's a two-player game, absolutely suitable for solitaire playing. In this review I'm going to show you briefly how the game works, and then I'm going to tell you my impressions about gameplay. And also I'm going to answer this phone call before I get in trouble. This is the map for the game. It is printed on standard Victory Point Games cardstock, and it represents the area of the conflict, and as you can see, the terrain is pretty problematic. A lot of woods and a lot of flooded hexes that will, of course, interfere with movement. This is the setup of the game with the Allied units behind that line there. I think you can see it, and with the German units on this other side of the line ready to defend. There are restrictions about the way in which you can place your units initially on the board, but you also have several choices that you can make. That means that from game to game you can experiment with different types of setup, which is always good. Both players have reserves that can be brought in during the game, but choosing to bring in reserves will affect the scoring at the end of the game. The German player will give points to the opponent for each unit that he chooses to bring in, whereas the Allied player will score points by not bringing in units. There is an amount of points that can be scored for each reserve that is not brought into the game. So that's an interesting choice that you have there. And a turn is divided in two player turns. First an American player turn and then a German player turn. At the beginning of a turn, you roll a die to determine air support. Then the Allied player takes his player turn, and in that player turn, the player can choose to move and then fight, or to fight and then move. Each player turn you can choose the order in which you do these things. If you fight and then move, the cool thing is that you get a bonus when you are fighting. That means you have been able to prepare your attacks, so you're more efficient than if you are just attacking on the go. After the Allied player has taken his turn, the German player will follow the same procedure to choose to attack and then to move, or to move and then to attack, and then the turn is over, and you repeat that for 7 turns. Movement, of course, is based on the movement allowance of the units that is printed at the bottom right corner of each counter. Interestingly enough, in this game, clear terrain costs 2 movement points, not 1 like in most games. Only roads cost 1 movement point, and that, of course, means that, well, the movement will be clearly oriented towards the roads. That movement cost emphasizes the role of the roads, which again facilitates a little bit the job for the Germans. They have less areas that they need to control, less areas where they know that they can expect the Allies to come. Also, units exert a zone of control in the 6-axis around them, and this is very important. To enter an enemy zone of control costs 1 extra movement point. To exit an enemy zone of control costs another extra movement point. Another important thing is that when you're trying to exit an enemy zone of control, you need to pass a morale check. You roll a die, the die roll may be modified by several factors, and you need to roll a modified number that is equal to or less than your best combat factor. Units have 2 combat factors, 1 for attack and 1 for defense. If you roll equal to or less than that, you can move without any penalty. If you fail to do so, well, several things may happen. If you fail to pass your morale check when you're trying to exit an enemy zone of control during your movement phase, then you're simply stuck there. You failed to exit a zone of control, which is annoying but not too bad. Much worse if you fail your morale check when you're trying to exit an enemy zone of control during combat. Because if you're trying to do so, it is because the combat result forces you to retreat, and if you fail the morale check, then, of course, if you're fighting or adjacent to your opponent, so you are in an enemy zone of control, if you fail your morale check, then your unit is destroyed, which is, of course, pretty bad. But I think it represents how the German morale at that point was pretty low. Units were ready to disgregate, to surrender. The morale of the Allied units is much better, so it is more likely then that units of the Allied player, when forced to retreat in combat, will indeed retreat. And that also represents how the Allies at that point of the war were readier to retreat and to concede some terrain and to accept some delay rather than to take losses in a war that at that point seemed already pretty much decided. The Allied player scores points for control of this location and or this location for German reserves that have been brought into the game by the German player, but also the Allied player scores points, and a lot of them, for Allied units that exited this edge here and for reserves that have not been brought into the game. But if, and only if, a supply line has been created that will basically unite these two edges of the board. In order to be able to score for exited units and reserves, you need to have a supply line that runs from one edge to the other and runs mostly on roads. Only one hex can be not road, so the supply line for scoring purposes must go on roads only or almost only, and of course must be free of enemy units and enemy zones of control. So the German player will want to prevent that, and possibly in the last couple of turns the German player may try a last-minute desperate movement and or attack just to be able to cut off that supply line, which is so crucial for scoring points. The German player will score units for each Allied unit that has been eliminated and for each Allied unit which is out of supply at the end of the game. Combat takes place between adjacent units or stacks of units, and it is resolved by first computing the odds between the total attack factor of the attacker or attackers and the total defense factor of the defender or defenders. The defense factor, of course, is the second number, attack factor, the first number. That amount of defense and or attack points can be modified by terrain. Once you have the initial odds, you find a column on this table, and the column can be modified by several factors such as fortifications, use of defensive or offensive air support, the fight and move choice, things like that. Once you have the final odds, you roll a die and you find the result. The result most likely will be one or two numbers. Only in one case you have an E, which represents all attackers are eliminated. The first result applies to the attacker, the second to the defender. But you see these numbers here, actually they do represent different things. The red numbers that apply to the attacker represent the number of units of the attacker that must retreat by 1x. They must pass a morale check, but then if they pass it, they must retreat. This is the number of units. For the defender, this number here, which is a 1 or a 2, represent the number of hexes that all of defending units must retreat. So all of the defending units will have to retreat if they receive a numerical result. That means that all of them must pass a morale check, otherwise they are going to be destroyed in the process of leaving or trying to leave the enemy zone of control in which they are being attacked. The defender, in fact, can also choose to simply use that number as the number of steps that are lost, meaning the defender can voluntarily choose to take casualties rather than to pass a check. I have a 2 here, I can just destroy 2 of my units in case, suppose I have 3 in the X, rather than to try to move all of them, all 3 of them, and maybe they all have low morale, so there's a chance that if I try to move all of them by 2 X's, maybe all of them will be destroyed in the process, all of them will surrender, so I prefer to just destroy 3 units, at least 1 unit is left in the X. So the defender only, never the attacker, has the opportunity to convert some of these X's that should be retreated into casualties. And there are cases in which this choice that seems so unpopular and so problematic may not be the worst one available to you. This is a game that has pluses and minuses, I think. On the plus side, I really like the way in which the mechanics mirror the psychological situation of the time, how there are forces behind that clearly connected with the material strength of the unit, but that is not all that there is. Again, this is the aspect that forces units to retreat and to surrender, to disappear from the map. I like how the victory conditions really create different objectives for the two sides. The German player is just trying to slow down the opponent and try to slow down his zone retreat. The German player will use terrain features and zones of control to achieve this. Because of this, the German side may be a little less exciting to play. As the Allied side, you have the burden of the attack. You must be able to clear that road to be able to score a considerable amount of points. Possibly you will also try to take control of the cities at the bottom of the map, but the point is that, and this I like actually, that you're not trying to destroy the opponent. As the Allied player, you do not score points for eliminating German units, so just moving them away and making sure that they do not come back at the last minute to cut your supply lines, especially your victory supply line, the special one that you need at the end to be able to score points. Those are clearly vital things. But like this sort of like indirect object, it's not about destroying the opponent. It is, if anything, about this misplacing the opponent. Of course, if you destroy the opponent, you also achieve that. But per se, that is not the point. I also like a certain puzzle quality that the game has. I played the game as a solitaire, and I was more emotionally involved with the Allied side, precisely because I felt that the Allied side has this challenge. Given the time, the Allied side can overwhelm the Germans. The problem is that time is very limited. There are only 7 turns. There's a sort of like countdown clock feel to it, and I like this. Again, I felt the game really felt sort of like a puzzle, a riddle that I was trying to solve. Still intellectually playing both sides to the best of my possibilities, but psychologically playing on the side of, I want to say, if the Allies can win. The puzzle quality is enjoyable, entertaining. The game lasts an hour or so, or a little less sometimes. And again, this makes it a good game that you can set up quickly and play when you have a free hour, just to see how you can solve the puzzle, if you can solve the puzzle. On the other hand, the game, and probably this is connected with the puzzle-like quality, to me felt like it had an abstract component that maybe was a bit more than I find fully desirable in a war game. Especially in the last couple of turns, as I was playing the German side, I really thought that the point was to try to take control of that specific hex rather than that other, to make sure that I would be able to maneuver some units in such a way that I could cut the supply line at the end, the main supply line that allows the player to score points, and it really felt almost like, you know, chess-like or checkers-like quality that really was about taking control of that one specific area, positioning things in a specific way. Now, of course, maneuvering and controlling certain areas rather than others and cutting supply lines are all concepts that are at the core of so many war games, but there are the war games in which the theme somewhat shines through these aspects. Here I found that maybe because the game is so short, small, low counter density, small map with not so many axes, I just felt that those almost geometrical aspects of the game somewhat overwhelmed the theme at times. Overall, this is not a game that I hated, just it is not a game that I incredibly loved either. But as a solitaire game, to me, it works well. Again, a small game, a light game, a certain abstract puzzle quality, but as a puzzle that I may try to solve from time to time when I have an hour here, an hour there, late at night, and, you know, no one is there to play, say, online, then I think this is a game that I can enjoy.